Welcome to the EVMS Podcast. I am your host, Carlo Menoscal. Today, we welcome Dr. Josh Ramirez, a practitioner, researcher, and educator helping shape an emerging field known as behavioral project management. Josh's work sits at the intersection of project delivery and behavioral science, focused on a simple but uncomfortable reality. Projects don't fail just because the tools are wrong. They fail because humans operate under time pressure, cognitive overload, bias, and incomplete information while making high-stakes decisions. He is founder and CEO of the Institute for Neuro and Behavioral Project Management, founded in 2018 with colleagues Dr. Jody Wilson and Dr. Shari Debat. Together, they have been advancing the idea that project management should be designed around how the brain actually processes information, not just how we wish it did. Professionally, Josh has spent years in project management and project control roles on complex programs across the U.S. Department of Energy, including national laboratories. He has also taught project management as an adjunct professor and as a United States Army veteran. Many people know him for his work on NeuroPlan and the MPPQ credential, an evidence-based planning approach aimed at reducing predictable failures in planning and forecasting. He has also presented at the NDIA Integrated Program Management Division Forum on designing planning around cognition to improve accuracy and performance. Today, we're going to spend some time better understanding behavioral project management, while even well-intentioned plans fall apart, how optimism and cognitive bias quietly derails projects, and what leaders can do differently to build more realistic and reliable plans. Thank you, Dr. Josh, for joining us today. How are you? Happy New Year.
Great. Yeah, Happy New Year to you as well. Yeah, doing well. I appreciate the invitation to come and talk on your podcast. As we had mentioned before, you had been at the NDIA conference before when I presented once. And so, yeah, glad to be with you today.
Oh, great. So thanks again for joining us. So before we get into behavioral project management, I did want the public to get to know you a little better. So where did you grow up and what early experiences shaped how you think about work and problem solving today?
Yeah, I grew up on a ranch in Montana, herding cows for a living, about 21,000 acres and 700 head of cattle, and a lot of time to think on the back of a horse, herding cows, But I was kind of obsessed with figuring out how people think, even at an early age. And then later on, I got into the Army and then ended up in Tri-Cities, Washington at the Hanford Nuclear Reservation, part of the old Manhattan Project, doing some of the cleanup work there, and was in project controls and consistently seeing that even though we had all these great tools, basically projects tended to be optimistic in general, regardless of the planning or execution. I would talk to my friend, Dr. Jody Wilson at the time, and I was like, there's got to be a kind of a human brain thing going on here, right? It's more than just the tools. And she would just kind of point to her head and say, do they have one of these? And I was like, well, yeah. She's like, well, then it's probably got something to do with human behavior. So yeah, that kind of led me on a journey of trying to figure it out. And I would rush back to my computer and look up some of the things like optimism bias and the planning fallacy. And that led me into my PhD work. And then, simultaneously, I was writing NeuroPlan with Dr. Shadi Debates. So it's just been kind of an interesting journey of trying to figure out that intersection between project management and thinking.
Okay. Great. Well, thanks. Just out of curiosity, what did you do in the military?
I was a airborne infantryman.
Got it.
So,
great.
Jumping out of perfectly good airplanes.
Hey, that's an amazing experience. I'm sure your knees don't appreciate it though.
Yeah. No, they don't.
Yeah. So, what type of projects or environments first expose you to recurring planning and forecasting problems?
You say what kind of projects?
Yeah. What type of projects or environments first expose you to these recurring planning and forecasting issues?
Well, mostly very large projects, very complex projects, usually tens of millions, primarily in the Department of Energy world. Some of the remediation projects, such as at Hanford, some projects at the national laboratories. So it was, I'd say, primarily government work, although I've seen some of the same problems in the private sector as well.
Okay. So when you first noticed some of these patterns that you mentioned, did you think that they were organizational issues as well, or was it just suspecting that was there something deeper going on cognitively?
I think it was a little bit of a mix of both. Organizationally, the organization kind of sets the environment for cognition. So the organization, even if you look at some of the Department of Energy HPI literature, it shows, a lot of majority of errors are often rooted in organizational problems, but there's also individual cognition as well. So things like optimism bias or the planning fallacy. The planning fallacy may be more, and just for everyone's audience understands, the planning fallacy is basically just a tendency to underestimate. But the planning fallacy can have a lot of organizational and individual factors, whereas errors like optimism bias tend to be more individual.
So was there a specific moment when you realized that these problems weren't just technical or process issues?
I would say intuitively, I was kind of on that path for a while. I can't name the specific moment, but I will say that when I was looking at forecasting data month over month, where you would kind of look at like a CEI, current execution index, where you're looking at how many completions are we forecasting that we will finish next month or 2 months from now. And then we look at current performance data once that the actual performance comes in and see how many of those completions actually occurred. When I had access to that data is when it really hit, because I could see the trend quantitatively, right? I could see, we tend to be 40% optimistic every month, regardless, right? With very little swings towards pessimism and mostly swings towards optimism. And when you see that month after month, year after year, and you hear the project managers or the CAMs say, but next month it's going to recover. And you're like, after, about 4 or 5 months of that, you're like, I don't think that's going to actually occur because you typically are 40% optimistic every month, right? So when I was able to see that data on a month to month basis, it really kind of revealed things in a different light that I hadn't seen before. And it was just like, I see it now.
That aha moment.
Yeah, it
So,
wasn't random anymore.
yeah, no, I mean, when there's trends, usually that's a clear indicator that, things aren't going well in the project. And accountability, I mean, that must have been a little challenging for you to go back to management and show them what the CAMs are forecasting and then eventually hold them accountable to those estimate to completes, right?
Yeah, and the resistance, you start to get a lot of resistance at that level because the optimism continues to be pervasive. So even many managers will kind of take the latest forecast from the CAM or the PM and be like, yeah, but they said that they're going to complete those next month. I'm like, well, the last 2 years of data says otherwise, right? Yeah, but they said. And there's this kind of hope for the future that it can get done, but data that says otherwise. And so you get
So,
organizational and individual kind of pushback on that.
so in projects where they're very similar in actual history shows what was done back then, could that not be used in order to better plan this new similar project?
Yeah. I find that, I mean, is particularly in the government EVMS world, we spend a lot of time in compliance space, and that cognitive load is kind of used up on that. So when it comes time to do deeper analysis, like, what have we seen historically for this type of work, for example, the analysis just doesn't get done. So, things like reference class forecasting, which you're kind of referring to, is looking back to similar activities and saying, okay, well, how have similar activities in the past fared? And I find that a lot of times organizations don't have access to this data or have never prioritized getting access to that kind of data. So then without that kind of check on reality, we tend to just fall back to our heuristics or our mental habits.
Got it. So moving on, what led you to pursue a doctoral research focused on behavior and project management?
So I'd been wanting to get my PhD since about 2010 or so, and ended up getting laid off of a project back in 2012, and it just kind of paused my pursuit of my doctorate. And a few years later, got everything back in alignment, and I had really started to kind of narrow down my focus of where I wanted to go. I knew it was around human behavior, but I didn't quite have that specific thing that I was pursuing yet. I hadn't figured it out. And by the time 2015, 2016 rolled around, it became super obvious, especially with the forecasting data. And I was able to start measuring some of the stuff. And that's when I really locked in and under the advice of Dr. Wilson, I went to the Chicago School of Professional Psychology and had a very high focus on the integration between project management and cognitive science, which led to my dissertation toward a theory of behavioral project management.
Great. Well, thanks for sharing your expertise to the field. We greatly appreciate it. But for someone who doesn't understand behavioral project management for the first time, how do you explain behavioral project management in layman's terms for them to discern this concept?
I would say the most simplest way to describe it is designing project management around the brain. So if we look at standard project management processes right now, just open the PMBOK or any other manual, and it's really focused on, well, do this thing, right? Like just develop scope or just analyze risk, et cetera, et cetera. But it doesn't account for how the brain works if you're thinking about it in terms of like a computer or AI, right? For example, if you don't feed AI enough context, it gives you just kind of this loose general definition of what you're trying to look up, right?
Yeah,
So, the
hallucinates.
brain, and so, the brain can do this similar things. And so what I really found is that if you're combining the science of the brain with standard project management processes, you can start to design those processes around the way humans think. And so when I say designing project management around the brain, I'll give you a very simple example. There's a cognitive bias known as the anchoring effect, right? And the anchoring effect is kind of like, to simplify, if you go into a store and you see that a price tag is regular price $50, and it says now on sale, $20 off. Your brain was anchored to that $50. When you see $20 off, it makes it seem like a deal because you're anchored to the 50 and now you see 20 off of that, right? So the brain is anchored to the 50 first. So in project management, if we were designing around the brain, we know that the anchoring effect is going to impact project duration estimates, resource estimates, etc. So to prevent errors like such as the anchoring effect, we might design a process that says, or when putting together your estimate, make sure you do risk first because you want to be anchored to reality before estimating anything to do with, durations or resource quantities, for example. So designing around the brain is taking what we know about human cognition and then readjusting processes in order to account for that. So then you start to incrementally reduce the errors along the way.
So, unfortunately, we live in an environment of competitiveness. And so, particularly in the proposal planning, if you realistically propose the work how it should be planned properly, a lot of times you won't win the work. So, I think that's that contractors run into when,
Yeah.
uh, when developing proposals and trying to plan out, and there, unfortunately, years later, you are heavily overrunning projects and are delaying projects because of the issues with planning correctly from the onset, right? Yeah. So, why do you believe most planning problems are rooted in human cognition rather than tools and methodology?
Well, I think the tool, let's take a schedule, for example. when putting together a schedule for a plan, each one of the durations that we format and we come up with originate in someone's head. So while the tool is just a representation of human cognition that is now, formulated in terms of resource quantity or duration, length, etc. I think that humans tend to see something like a scheduling tool and assume, or the schedule output, and assume that what you're seeing is fact, but it really originated from the human. And so the tool is just a representation of something that started with human cognition. But the brain, in order to come up with that duration, had to do a lot of mental processing. And so if I ask you how long something takes, your brain is essentially accessing the automatic heuristics or mental shortcuts in your brain in order to come up with that duration. And that can be flawed in so many different ways. The planning fallacy, for example, that is the tendency to underestimate, originates from many different cognitive factors, optimism bias maybe only being one of them. But things like time pressure, cognitive load, etc., are all essentially filters that keep accurate information from being processed and or put onto paper. And so the tool is just a representation of human cognition on paper, so to say.
And then, unfortunately, a lot of contractors that are new to areas like EVMS, when they buy tools, they think that automatically gives them EVMS, right? And so,
Right.
not just the human part of it, but rather than just the fallacy of tool overloads and buying the suite of tools and thinking that, that they can perform EVMS just by, having these tools.
Right.
So if we accept this, then what does that say about most planning processes that are currently designed around, just regular project management methodologies?
I think what it tells us is that, well, one, we over rely on tools. But if we were to compare our brain to AI, for example, because it's the most simple concept, you can see the AI is constantly making mistakes. And AI has its own defaults, right? So for example, if it's answering a question for you, it's searching the internet. It may be searching the internet for, something you put into the chat, but it's really aggregating things that are most popular, most talked about, etc. The brain's doing something similar in that it only knows to process information based on what it has seen in the past. So if we look at how we're currently doing things compared to how we should be doing things, we should realize that there are errors in cognition of all types, right? And this is based on limited information that we have, and AI has, a software has, etc. And so if we realize that the planning fallacy is a tendency to underestimate durations, and we also realize that optimism bias isn't the only driver, we can see that the planning fallacy is really just a tendency to not have enough information to give an accurate estimate. And so what we need to do is find ways for the brain to access more information by taking away the limiting factors such as cognitive load, time pressures, low psychological safety, etc. So you do that by both designing the software so that the process maybe follows a particular flow. It asks you questions that causes you to think of things you hadn't thought of before. It keeps you from anchoring. Hopefully it reduces cognitive load and through simplification. That's another thing too, as people say, well, I've often heard people say, well, if I learn behavioral project management, am I just learning more complex process that I have to add on top of my current knowledge base? And the answer is that behavioral project management doesn't seek to make things more complex, it just seeks to design to reduce the complexity towards more clear cognition, right? So as in behavioral project management, we are not interested in overcomplicating things. If anything, we're interested in reducing the complication, the complexity, in order to get simplicity to the most effective method that's been found to bring project success.
And then you also run into the problems where, contractors are running a very lean team, right? And so cognitive overload is a major factor there.
Yes.
Plus the time pressures of deliveries and influence of compliance and punitive compliance, particularly. I know we discussed that with Wayne Abba in the last podcast. Plays a major part, and there unfortunately doesn't allow the contractor to perform at their best in any particular project because of all these different influences that just overload the brain, so to speak,
Yep.
right?
Well, and what
So
happens too is cognitive load is not just inconvenient. What cognitive load does is it causes automatic thinking. So automatic thinking in cognitive science is known as system one. And so when you have automatic thinking, your brain defaults to what it thinks it knows. I say thinks it knows, not necessarily always knows.
yeah.
And so that anything to do with automatic thinking increases the reliance on processes in the brain that can cause cognitive errors. Some cognitive scientists say that we are in automatic mode 95% of the day because your brain just can't be in deliberate thinking, heavy thinking for extended periods of time. And the brain tends to want to do automatic thinking because it's more comfortable. So when you increase cognitive load, it's just not an inconvenience of, I just feel overloaded today. It's actually restricting mental processing. And that restriction of mental processing is what results in less information being processed, such as scope identification, risk identification, resource quantification, etc. And with that comes underestimation by default. So underestimation in many cases is what results in projects going over schedule or over budget later, right? Because you underestimate it. It doesn't mean that it was necessarily due to intentional optimism bias, so much as we didn't have enough information, and we didn't have enough information because our mental processing was restricted.
So why are experienced, intelligent teams that have great project management processes still vulnerable to these biases?
Well, let's look at something like the cognitive load issue again. Even if you're highly experienced, you will still default to automatic thinking. Now, a more experienced team is going to have better habits, right? But those better habits are still not going to completely cover the gap. And there's often this kind of assumption that, well, I'm under time pressure, but I do better under time pressure. Okay, well, maybe you do things faster under time pressure. That doesn't necessarily mean that your mental processing is better under time pressure. And so, I often hear this assumption that, well, I perform better under time pressure and, I just drink more coffee or I have an energy drink and that does it for me, right? And it's like, well, the striatum in the brain, which shuts down the inhibition system and causes more automatic thinking, the striatum is in every brain. If you have a brain, you have the striatum in the brain. You cannot say that, well, I am better with coffee or an energy drink or because I have more experience. The fact of the matter is that everyone has the striatum in the brain, so you can't change that, right? And so we have to learn to account for those types of things and design our processes around them.
So moving into optimism bias and planning failure, what does optimism bias typically look like during a planning session?
So the interesting thing is that I find that optimism bias itself isn't as prevalent as we might think. The projects tend to be optimistically planned, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there is optimism bias at play, like we were just discussing with the planning fallacy. But optimism bias itself, typically in a planning situation, looks like even if you've been given all the scope, all the risks, etc., the planner, the PM, the CAM, etc., still will counter that with, well, I think we can still get it done, right? I have confidence that, the team can perform, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What I look for in optimism bias in a plan is not necessarily that the plan is optimistic, but that even given all the information that would say that there is another reality, that PM or CAM is still countering that with, yeah, but, right? Yeah, but. And so that's where I think you really start to see where the optimism bias comes in.
So what is one subtle sign that tells that a team has already crossed from realism into wishful thinking?
Well, the The optimism bias scenario is probably one of the best examples of that. But I think what I've also seen is groupthink error. So when the group starts to collectively kind of shut down the naysayers, so to say, or those who are questioning the reality or trying to add risk to the project, for example, I think we start to see in many cases that the group starts moving towards kind of denying reality. And when you start to get that kind of groupthink error, it's hard for anyone to come in and kind of question those optimistic figures, for example. And so I think that's when you start to see that team move from, okay, we're considering all realities to, it's going to be fine. And then as a group, it really becomes hard for an individual to go against the grain.
So why do teams consistently underestimate effort, complexity, and rework?
I think that really goes back to that planning fallacy bias again, but there are so many things that contribute to it. So for example, when we were writing NeuroPlan, more and more research that I did, I found that really NeuroPlan was addressing the planning fallacy, because the planning fallacy is built up of optimism bias, the anchoring effect, time pressure, cognitive dissonance, cognitive load. I can go on and on and on. I mean, basically, it really comes down to plans do tend to be optimistic and do tend to be underestimated. And we tend to blame that a lot on the execution phase of the project, right? We get into execution and say, well, the contractor didn't show up, or the contractor was slower than we expected, et cetera. But if you look across many different projects, you'll find that effort always took longer than we expected, right? Things were predictable from the get-go, but we blame it on execution and say, yeah, but, that resource was slower. Well, okay, if we look back to project history across the portfolio, we find that resource always took longer. So maybe it wasn't a resource efficiency issue. It was the fact that doing that work always takes that long. And so we tend to underestimate generally, because the planning fallacy is built up of many different errors that essentially build on themselves, whether it's at the organizational level or at the individual level. And so underestimation is not just optimism bias or just the anchoring effect. Underestimation is built up of a lot of factors, whether we're intentionally optimistic or we don't have enough information to fully develop the scope, the risk, the resource quantities. And I find that in most cases, it's really lack of information. But if you pull the string on lack of information, the lack of information is due to so many other factors, right? Just going back to the time pressure or cognitive load, for example, if you're under cognitive load, you're going to process things automatically, period. And when you process things automatically, you're just not getting enough information.
So in what ways does social pressure influence people to agree with unrealistic plans?
That's a big one. So remember, we were talking about groupthink. So social pressure has been found to be one of the greatest motivators of human behavior. So there was a Department of Energy study, I think it was in renewable energy or something of that nature. But essentially what they were doing was trying to have people reduce their energy consumption, like, turn off your lights when you're not using them, etc. And they did a study and found that if they put out flyers that, and I'm paraphrasing, by the way, but if they put out flyers around the neighborhood that said, hey, your neighbor reduced their energy consumption by X by doing this, that, or the other. Even the fact that maybe they didn't know their neighbors in the neighborhood next door by name or never even seen them, the fact that they said someone else was doing this thing caused those people to reduce their energy consumption. So social pressure, even with from people we don't know, can change behavior. Now, you put that in a project management context, projects are team environments under time pressure. Things like, the planning session that I was talking about where, someone brings up a risk and the group is now committed so much to the current plan that they don't want to change anything. As a group, that groupthink error can start to really shut down dissenting opinions. And the social pressure becomes so overwhelming that nothing is going to change at that point. So social pressure is one of the greatest motivators of human behavior.
So moving on, why do risks that seem obvious in hindsight rarely surface early enough?
Well, there's the hindsight bias. And the hindsight bias is basically what you're talking about. I mean, you look back and you're like, yeah, I could have predicted that, or I predicted that. The hindsight bias is very strong. And so that keeps us from making corrections because they say, well, I already knew that, or, I could have predicted that. But there are different types of uncertainty. And one uncertainty is called aleatoric uncertainty, which is essentially completely unpredictable events like COVID, for example, or an earthquake. Then there's epistemic uncertainty. And epistemic uncertainty is something that's uncertain to me, for example, individually, but it is known somewhere. So someone knows about this uncertainty, or it exists in information, or it exists in our system in the company, but I don't know about it individually. And so to close the gap on risk, what we need to do is reduce the risk that we can get information about, even if it's an unknown to us, maybe a known unknown to someone else, or a known to someone else. An interesting little study I did on one of the projects was I went over a period about 7 weeks, so 7 forecasting periods, and they were running at about 40% optimistic from week to week. And I categorized all the activities that didn't get completed in the following week, so their actual performance was low on those specific activities. And I categorized them based on what the project manager was saying those delays were caused by, and fell into 2 categories. One was the epistemic and one was the aleatoric. And 65% of those delays were epistemic. So they were predictable, they were preventable, they were known somewhere in the organization. Now, 65% is a huge number. So that's like 2/3 of the delays were preventable.
Oh.
That falls into the epistemic uncertainty category. Now, if 2/3 of the delays were preventable, that takes you down from 40% optimistic to 15, 17% optimistic, which is a better margin of error. So essentially we were causing delays and cost overruns that could have been preventable. Epistemic uncertainty is where you close the information gap. And the information gap is closed by better cognition. If I know to ask the right questions, if I'm under less time pressure or cognitive load, anytime I'm making a prediction, I'm closing the epistemic uncertainty gap so that I have narrower margins of error, right? And that translates into less schedule delay and less cost overrun.
So I've seen you share some of your MRI scans on presentations of the past. Would you mind sharing some of those so we can visually understand what you're talking about, these overloads and time pressures?
Yeah, let me see if I can pull that up real quick. So this will just kind of give you an idea of, what the brain looks like on project management. I would say project management specific areas that are applicable. These are fMRI scans, which is essentially a brain scan using functional MRI. And so you can see that this is your brain on prediction. You can see there's a little area lighting up here, the little orange dots. This is your brain on optimism bias. So you can see that the brain is lighting up for future positive significantly up here, but future negative has, quite reduced impacts here in the brain. This is your brain on confirmation bias. So for those who may not know, confirmation bias is the tendency to seek information that confirms what we already believe. And so in risk and scope planning, this is bad because we get locked into something like, we think this, activity is going to take, 2 months to complete. Now we start looking for more information that supports that versus information that might counter that. And so then that results in motivated reasoning. So motivated reasoning is trying to reason away the realities and to make it fit within that picture that we already have in our head. So this is your brain on motivated reasoning. So motivated reasoning is typically a response to confirmation bias. This is your brain on risk, and then this is your brain on uncertainty. So there's in behavioral project management, we're looking at the brain kind of like a computer, like it's like I was talking about the striatum earlier. So the striatum responds to time pressure. And under time pressure, we tend to default to automatic thinking. Well, everyone's got, a striatum in their brain. And so everyone is going to respond to time pressure for the most part the same way. So the great thing about behavior project management is we can start to see commonalities among humans, regardless of personality. In the old days, and even a lot of times in business today, we tend to focus more on personality profiles. But personality profiles vary and change even within the same individual over years. There are some things that don't change though, regardless of personality, and those are the things to focus on. So from the brain's perspective, everyone has an amygdala, everyone has striatum, everyone has a prefrontal cortex, and so if we understand the functions of those, then we can design project management around that.
So on these scans, someone that is pessimistic versus optimistic, the same volume of activity in the brain will be repeatedly the same in terms of risk and optimism and all these biases?
For the most part, yes. For the most part,
Okay.
I like to reframe pessimism bias, by the way, too. So there's some people may say, well, I tend to be more pessimistic than optimistic. And by the way, that's a good trait to have when doing risk analysis. But I often reframe pessimism because even someone who's pessimistic is they're pessimistic for a reason. So if I'm pessimistic, I'm trying to solve a problem in many cases. I don't want the surprise. So I tend to be pessimistic because I'm trying to reduce my own personal uncertainty. Why are we trying to reduce personal uncertainty? More realistically, for optimistic reasons, because you're trying to essentially be better prepared for the future, which is an optimistic lens. So technically speaking, in many cases, when you're pessimistic, you're actually being optimistic through a different route, right?
Insightful. So moving on to improving planning through behavioral design, what changes when planning is designed around how the brain actually works?
So I did a study at another DOE project, and the interesting thing is that I didn't train anyone around cognitive biases that have to do with planning. And we did this over about 5 or 6 reporting periods, measuring planning accuracy month over month. And the result was we had an 80% improvement in on-time delivery. So we went from 50% optimistic on average down to about 10% optimistic. And there was no drop in performance. So it's not like people were being more pessimistic, resulting in lower performance. The performance didn't change, only the optimism in the plan changed, which means that now we have a better look at what realistically is going to occur.
A better baseline.
And so, yeah. And so the interesting thing about designing is that I wasn't doing training and saying, now you know how optimism bias works. Now you know how the planning fallacy works. Do X. And now that you have this knowledge about the brain, go and change the world. What we were doing was designing the environment, designing the forecasting sessions, et cetera, around cognitive science. So without training on behavioral project management, we were able to get that improvement. And it was small things, little tweaks. If you know what tweaks to use, then essentially you're concentrating your effort on the right things that have better outcomes. So simple things. For example, in project controls, some teams may send spreadsheets to their CAMs to update the remaining durations so that they can go and update the schedule. I said, stop sending spreadsheets. You need to have a live forecasting session with the CAM, and you need to show them the visualization of the Gantt chart, which means close all your columns on the left-hand side. Those of us in project controls who have a lot of activity codes, et cetera, we know sometimes we've got 12, 15 columns open because we're updating
percent completions, everything. Yeah.
Exactly. So, being a project controls guy, I understand that. And, I used to do the same thing myself. The small tweak was close the columns, open up the Gantt chart. You shouldn't be seeing, an inch worth of activities that are all in quarters in P6. You should see 2/3 of the screen visually, because visualization reduces the cognitive errors. So the other thing too is facilitated forecasting or facilitated planning. People tend to be more optimistic on their own work than someone that is outside of the project. So the CAM is going to tend to be more optimistic than their project controls engineer, for example. Now, that what this really does is it shows that project controls should be playing a greater role in projects than they currently do, because they become the person that questions the optimism and inserts more reality. So if I'm having a face-to-face forecasting plan or planning session with my project controls engineer, I'm likely going to have incrementally better or more reliable forecaster plans. So don't be sending emails. You should be having a Zoom session or an in-person session when doing that forecasting and planning. The other thing is unpacking activities. So planning packages are bad for this. Planning packages encourage bad behavior, because what they've shown in cognitive science and project management is that if you unpack the activity into greater detail, obviously you find more scope, you can identify more risk, etc. If you're doing that just in your head and you end up with this, 50-day duration activity, your brain doesn't get a chance to process the information in the way it should. So you should always be progressively elaborating your schedule into more detail. And I like the 880 rule. I don't know if you've heard of that one. But,
Yes.
basically, for your audience, your activities should be, somewhere between 8 and 80 hours of, if you're using labor, for example, and quantifying your duration from that. If you're above that, the tendency to be more optimistic is going to increase because you haven't unpacked to a granular enough level. Now, a lot of PCEs, a lot of CAMs or PMs may resist that. The reason why they're resisting that is because that increases cognitive load. You're having to work, your brain is having to work harder in order to unpack that information. Which brings me to another interesting point. They found that people in many cases would prefer to endure physical pain over hard thinking. So that shows you just how much the brain resists hard thinking. But it's the hard thinking that actually gets you more information, and more information results in less underestimation. But cognition and hard thinking takes energy, whether it's AI or whether it's in the brain, right? So even if you're looking at AI, in order to get a better report, you're going to have to put it in deep research mode, because even AI is just going to go and do, really quick analysis, give you kind of summary level stuff, but you're not going to get where you need to go.
So, how do government contractors better implement planning packages, understanding that they're not very practical in terms of being very objective?
There's nothing wrong with a planning package that's rolled up at the reporting level. Let's say you have a 100-day long activity that's a planning package. You're going to get it planned into more detail later, and it's 12 months out. The issue isn't the fact that it's a 100-day activity that's 12 months in the future. The issue is, did you unpack it enough when you were planning that 100-day activity in order to have the confidence that that 100 days is at least somewhat reliable? So I always say, unpack as much as you can and then repack if necessary.
Got it.
Right?
Got it.
So you should be getting down into that granular detail to get to the confidence level. Yeah, we understand the planning package may change in the future, but we're trying to access as much information as possible up front, because no one wants a schedule variance or a cost variance on that activity later, especially, if you think about if that planning package is driving the critical path. If that duration extends, you're going to have a schedule variance later.
Okay. So, how does shifting from how long will it take to how much effort is required changes outcomes?
So I always say the worst thing that you can possibly ask a CAM or a PM is how long this will take. And boy, am I guilty of it too. So if I ask how long something will take, the brain really isn't forced to do as much of the cognitive processing as it would have, because your heuristics, which is essentially your defaulted thinking, are just going to default to what it thinks it knows. Once again, remember I said what it thinks it knows versus what it knows. And sometimes those are different things. So if I ask how much effort is involved for some reason, there's some different cognitive processing that goes on in the brain that's shown that you're going to increase the reliability of that resource quantification. Because if I ask how much effort is involved, I'm switching gears to some of the drivers of the duration versus the summary level estimation of the duration. So I don't want to be causing my brain to summarize. I want it to dig several levels deeper to essentially build the details of what drives that duration estimate. There's often very small tweaks in cognitive science that we do in order to have big outcome changes. And some of those small tweaks are things like, instead of asking, how long will this take? Ask, how much effort is it going to take? There's another example of obstacle identification. If we asked to identify the obstacles to activity completion prior to making the estimate, the reliability tends to go up with that as well. And all I did was small tweaks. I asked how much effort, I asked what obstacles will be in the way of activity completion. And all those are prior to making the formal estimate, right? So we're also trying to prevent the anchoring effect by, for example, asking about obstacles before the estimate is done. That reduces the anchoring effect, right? So we're back to that behavioral design concept where we're designing the sequence of processes as well as the questions that are asked.
So you can incorporate, even when you're detail planning a work package and using quantifiable data backups, instead of just, laying out the different tasks and the hours and the percentages that roll up to the work package, you can include resource loading, all these different additional insights that would provide a more accurate, realistic outcome of
Right.
what it takes to complete a work package.
Yeah. And if you think about it too, if you're doing better planning and forecasting, what you're really doing is accelerating work. And I'll give you an example of that one study that I did on the epistemic versus aleatoric uncertainty. A lot of the justifications I heard from the PM for the delay were things like, well, team A showed up to site 1 on Wednesday. And when they did, team B was already there. So team A couldn't perform work in the same space that team B was performing work. That was a bad forecast. Someone could have picked up the phone, found out if someone else was on the calendar, the schedule, and could have prevented that downtime. Well, what happens when team A shows up on site 1 and they can't perform work? Well, they have to go redeploy to another work package, or they have to wait for another work package to be available, etc. Regardless, you have waste, right? Because even if it takes only 4 hours to redeploy to another work package or another project, that's 4 hours times, let's say, a team of 6 at $150 an hour. You had a 4-hour delay plus several $1,000s in cost variance. That could have been prevented. So good prediction actually accelerates work. It doesn't slow it down. The problem is that our brains, it's not like people are bad people. It's just our brains don't like to do predictive work. Predictive work takes more cognitive effort than reactive work.
So moving to the final parts here, how did your research and practical experience ultimately lead to development of Neural Plan and the certifications offered through your institute?
So basically, it started with that curiosity of why are projects always optimistic? Well, for the most part, optimistic. And then that led into my PhD and my research there. And during that process, essentially, it became apparent and obvious, especially with my work in government projects and project controls, that I could actually pull this together into a package that hadn't been done before and really just kind of rewrite what planning and forecasting and risk analysis should look like from the brain's perspective. Because the research became so clear and I found so much that it wasn't guessing anymore. And it wasn't as simple things like, hey, be less optimistic. Anyone can say that. I found so much. As a matter of fact, Neural Plan is based in 260 evidence-based sources. So it's not a guesstimate, right? That it was so apparent. It was so apparent during the COVID period. I really started digging into it, and I had met Shadi Debates. She's from Belgium, and she is a cognitive scientist in forecasting. I had met her at the Judgment and Decision Making Conference in 2017, I believe it was. And during the COVID era, we were like, you know what? This is really all coming together. And I called her and I was like, hey, you want to write the neuroplan certification? She was like, okay. So we spent the next year and a half doing that. And a lot of long nights and early mornings because, she's in Belgium. So I'd be up at like 2 a.m. so we could get on video and do the training and put it all together. But it just became so obvious and the research was there. And I realized that it hadn't been put out anywhere else yet. And so we just got together and put a date on it. And by the way, we were on schedule. So I was really scared of that. I was like, I'm writing a certification on more accurate planning. I better make sure this is actually on schedule. We completed on schedule. So I was like, whew.
Well, good for you. Good for you. So final takeaways. So if a project leader could change just a few behaviors or planning habits starting tomorrow, what would have the biggest impact?
Unpacking. So unpacking is also good. Unpacking is good for general decision making, just in your personal life as well. So I used to, when I was in project controls, I'd get an activity duration estimate from a CAM or something. It'd be 30 days long and say, well, can you just break this down into 3 activities for me? And just that one question brought up so much. For example, I did a series of activities where we just unpacked it into 3s. And we found that the project ended up taking 6 months longer and moved into the next fiscal period. That had implications on not just the project estimate, but the contract period estimates as well, right? The EACs, et cetera, et cetera. So unpacking causes the brain to move from automatic thinking, system 1, into more system 2, which is more deliberate thinking. So if I say 2 plus 2, you say 4. That was automatic. You didn't have to think about it. If I say 567 times 923, you're going to have to get out your calculator. So system 1, you use system 1 to give me the 2 plus 2 answer. You would have to use system 2 to give me the second answer. And so if I ask a PM to unpack their activities into greater detail, it's not a simple thing it's not like you're just asking them to name 3 different aspects of those activities. You're forcing the brain into system 2. You're forcing the brain to do more deliberate thinking on scope, on risk, on resource quantification. And so when you do that, you get more information on those activities than you would have otherwise got. So unpacking is always my first recommendation. Unpack, 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 unpack. The other thing is asking how much effort is going to be involved in the activity and before you ask how long something would take.
How long? Yeah, right. Yeah.
Right. And then the third one is ask what obstacles are will get in the way of completion of the activity. And obstacles, by the way, are different than risks because obstacles are things that do occur and risks are things that may or may not occur. And obstacles feels safer to the brain because risk may represent something bad that can happen. And the brain doesn't like to think about bad things that can happen. But if I frame obstacles, essentially what I'm asking is what things will get in the way. And that is safer for the brain to think about. So obstacle identification is not the same as risk identification. So those 3 things are really important.
Great. So one final thing is I've noticed listening to your work that keeps pointing towards something bigger, what you've called project science. As that thinking has evolved, you've also started building the Project Science Institute as a culmination of that research. Can you unpack what project science really means and how the Institute fits into where this work is headed?
Yeah, so I'm founding the Project Science Institute right now. The idea is that, let me reframe that real quick. In current project management literature, we'll use the PMBOK as an example. It's built up of processes that are grounded in anecdote, committee votes, sometimes opinion. You can't go to the back of the PMBOK and see, 500 references and citations of where that process came from. And that's problematic because if you go and Google Scholar right now, you put project management in quotes and hit search, you're going to get like 2.2 million results. That's 2.2 million results that I have not seen in project management associations or institutions. So what I learned during my dissertation process for my doctorate was that project management right now on the practitioner base is not grounded in evidence in many cases. Or if it is, we can't see where it's coming from because the sources aren't being cited. So behavioral project management really opened the doors to designing project management around humans. And if if we look into project management, we find that in most cases, it's how the human makes the decisions that is more impactful than whether you would do a Monte Carlo or a critical path, for example. So with that, it became super clear that what we needed was to build an organization that was grounded in evidence, science. So I see it as not just project management from a traditional standpoint, but project science, because it's essentially evidence-based project management. And no organization yet has put all that together. And one of the big reasons being is because it is such a large lift, because you're looking at processing millions of papers, not only from the project management side, but also from the cognitive science side, because we have to bring in both behavioral project management and all other technical project management science in order to bring that picture together. The future of project science will be kind of like a project science body of knowledge versus, the traditional PMBOK or something of that nature. But it's a very large effort. It's going to take a lot of research, a lot of it which has already been done through the behavioral project management side. And I've got a great team together, obviously doing it. Dr. Jody Wilson, Dr. Josh Cuneo, who wrote the project integrated lessons learned framework, Dr. Mel Slater. So yeah, it's a work in progress, but I can imagine that software will be designed from project science in the future. You'll have future publications, future certifications, et cetera. But there's a lot of work to get there.
If a contractor is looking for your expertise, how would they find you?
We have the behavioral project management website at behavioralpm.com and the Neural Plan website, which is neural, neural -plan.com. And then, of course, you can reach out to me on LinkedIn. We do evidence-based project management from just strictly evidence-based side, but also from the cognitive science side. So we're also implementing into AI as well. A lot of the work in AI will reduce cognitive load, as well as automatically designing processes so that people don't have to think about them as much, and they're just doing them straight into the software. So there's a lot of stuff a lot of potential in the software development side as well.
That's great. I look forward to looking into that work of yours and utilizing it in my future projects. So, Dr. Ramirez, once again, thank you very much for coming on the podcast and sharing your expertise.
My pleasure.
I truly value your knowledge and everything that you shared across the industries. And I wish you the best of luck in this new year, and look forward to perhaps running into each other again in future conferences.
Awesome. I appreciate the invitation. Thanks so much.
Thank you, and we'll be talking soon. Bye-bye.